Welcome, history lovers. Today we drift back in time to explore the fascinating world of medieval Irish food, from humble peasant meals to the grand feasts of kings. Journey with us as we uncover the stories behind every loaf, every stew, and every feast, and discover how food shaped lives, culture, and power in medieval Ireland. If you enjoy traveling through time with us, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more videos that bring history to life. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an adventure into the past. Imagine sitting at a rough wooden table in a small timber house somewhere in medieval Ireland. Outside, the wind presses against the thatched roof, bending the tall grass and rippling across open fields. The sun is fading, and the sky glows orange and purple at the horizon. Inside, only source of light is the fire crackling in the center of the room, its smoke slowly curling upward toward a hole in the roof. The smell of peat, damp earth, and boiling broth hangs thick in the air. A pot is suspended over the flames, bubbling gently. For a moment, you might think a feast is being prepared. But what's inside that pot stand, the story behind it, far more complex than it appears. We tend to imagine medieval food as gigantic feasts, overflowing platters, and kings tearing into roasted meat. Movies and television have given us endless scenes of long banquet tables, golden goblets, and piles of bread. But for most of the people who lived in Ireland centuries ago, dinner looked and felt very different. Food was not only about taste or enjoyment. It was deeply tied to survival, to work, to nature, to religion, and to power. What someone ate told a story about who they were, how wealthy their family was, where they lived, and even what kind of life they could hope to have. So, let's return to that small house in the Irish countryside. The person stirring the pot is likely a woman who has spent most of the day working tending cattle, gathering herbs, caring for children, mending clothes, and doing countless tasks that kept the household alive. The pot contains a mixture of oats simmering in water or milk, with maybe a handful of vegetables added for flavor. There is no spice rack full of exotic seasonings. There is no sugar. Salt, if it exists in this home at all, is precious and rationed carefully. The meal is simple, perhaps plain to our modern tastes, but it represents the incredible effort of farming, gathering, preserving, and managing limited resources throughout the year. Medieval Ireland was not covered in wealthy cities or bustling markets the way some parts of Europe were. It was largely rural. People lived in scattered farming communities, surrounded by land that both sustained and challenged them. The ability to grow food, raise livestock, and store it properly determined whether families survived harsh winters, sudden storms, or unexpected famine. Weather was powerful. A single bad harvest could reshape entire communities. So when you picture medieval Irish tables, imagine more than just food on a plate. Imagine anxiety, planning, hope, and gratitude mixed into every bite. Cattle, especially, stood at the center of Irish life. Owning cows meant milk, butter, cheese, and buttermilk foods that could be preserved, traded, shared, or consumed fresh. Cattle also represented wealth and status. They were more than animals. They symbolized security. Stories, myths, and legal traditions all revolved around the value of cattle. In some tales, wars were fought over them. So, every drop of milk had meaning. It was nourishment, but it was also power, culture, and identity. When the day ended, families gathered around a shared bowl or simple wooden trenchers. There were no individual plates piled high with food. Meals were communal. People ate together, passing ladles, dipping spoons, and sharing whatever they had. Children learned early not just how to eat, but how to respect food because waste was dangerous. Throwing away resources could mean hunger later in the season. Preservations, smoking, drying, fermenting was not a culinary trend. It was a strategy for survival that everyone understood instinctively, and yet medieval Irish food was not bleak or emotionless. Meals were woven into the rhythm of life. They marked celebrations, religious observances, and seasonal changes. The first milk of spring carried symbolic importance. Harvest time meant gatherings, songs, gratitude, and relief. When great events took place, marriages, visits from guests' food became a way of expressing generosity and honor. Offering hospitality was seen as a moral duty. To welcome someone with bread, butter, or ale was a statement. You are safe here. You belong here. You are respected. Still, these gestures of warmth existed alongside harsh reality. While peasants focused on making enough to survive, nobles and rulers lived in a different world. They controlled land, resources, and often the people who worked the fields. For them, food could be a tool symbol of dominance. Grand feasts displayed authority and wealth, reminding everyone who had power. When kings hosted elaborate banquets, they weren't simply feeding their guests. They were making political statements. They were proving that under their leadership, abundance was possible, and loyalty was expected in return. To sit at a king's table wasn't only about pleasure. It was a privilege, a sign of belonging to an inner circle. But here's the interesting part. Even those kings and nobles did not live in constant luxury. Medieval life meant cycles of scarcity and abundance that affected everyone. Weather didn't care about social class. Disease didn't ask whether you were rich. A bad harvest, a brutal winter, or a raid could disrupt supply lines and create shortages that no feast could hide. This fragile balance made food deeply meaningful, even philosophical. People saw it as a blessing, a trial, a test, and at times a miracle. Imagine now that same wooden house late at night. The fire has burned down. The pot has been emptied as much as possible, scraped clean to avoid waste. Outside, the stars blanket the sky, bright, cold, and indifferent. The family lies down to sleep on straw beds, their stomachs satisfied enough to rest, but never full enough to forget that tomorrow they must work again. Every meal reminds them of their dependence on land, weather, animals, and community. Across the landscape, there are other fires burning. In monasteries, monks kneel in quiet prayer after a modest supper, ready to rise early and tend gardens or copy manuscripts. In the hall of a local chieftain, music echoes through the night as warriors eat roasted meat, drink ale, and listen to epic poetry. In distant markets, traders unpack sacks of grain, casks of wine, and exotic spices meant for the wealthy. Each location has different sounds, smells, and conversations, yet they are all connected by the same essential truth. Food shapes society. It shapes behavior, rules, customs, and relationships. Who eats first matters. Who receives the best piece matters. Who is invited to sit at the tableland? Who is left outside? Tells us everything about hierarchy in medieval Ireland. Hospitality was tied to honor. Chiefs were judged not only by their strength in battle, but also by their ability to feed guests generously. A stingy host damaged his reputation. A generous one strengthened alliances. Travelers and storytellers spread tales of incredible feasts where tables overflowed and everyone left satisfied. These narratives were partly entertainment, but also partly idealized visions of order and abundance. They imagined a world where good leaders ensured no one went hungry, even though reality was often far messier. Religion layered another dimension onto food. Certain days required fasting or avoiding certain meats. Eating became an act of discipline, reflection, and devotion. People were reminded that food was not merely theirs, it was a gift from God entrusted to them. Monasteries took this idea seriously. They stored food carefully, shared with the poor, and ran kitchens that balanced restraint with charity. They experimented with agriculture, tended orchards, and organized gardens that influenced surrounding communities. Through these quiet labors, they shaped Ireland's food culture just as powerfully as kings did. Now, picture that pot, again the pot, bubbling over the fire in that small wooden home. It represents generations of accumulated knowledge. How long to cook grains so they become tender. How to smoke fish so it lasts months without spoiling. How to churn butter. How to ferment milk. How to collect herbs that healed sickness or added subtle flavor. None of these skills came from cookbooks. They were learned through watching, listening, and doing. Children grew up seeing their parents and grandparents work with food constantly. They learned when to plant, when to harvest, when to slaughter animals, and when to let fields rest. They learned patience. They learned respect for land, animals, and community. And they learned that food is never separate from history. It is history embodied in daily routines. So when we talk about medieval Irish food, we are not simply discussing recipes. We are exploring the entire structure of life. We are examining class divisions, seasonal rhythms, faith, economy, and storytelling. We are uncovering how people thought, feared, hoped, and survived. The smallest bowl of porridge can reveal more than an entire chronicle of battles. A single feast can explain more about politics than a stack of government records. If you could step fully into that world, taste the smoky stew, break the rough bread, drink the fresh buttermilk, you would taste centuries of tradition. You would feel how different life was when nature controlled everything and waste could be deadly. You would understand how deeply people valued the simplest meal, not because it was glamorous, but because it meant life. Life continued one more day, and yet, despite all the struggle, there was beauty there. The gathering around the fire, the shared laughter at the table, the sense that food connected families, neighbors, and strangers. Hospitality brought people together in ways bigger than hunger. To be invited into someone's home was to be trusted. To be fed was to be honored. These small daily rituals formed invisible threads, holding medieval communities together. So, as we begin our journey through medieval Ireland, from humble peasant huts to magnificent royal halls, remember that every bite carried a story. Every meal reflected power, faith, love, and survival. What seems ordinary, a bowl of oats, a piece of cheese, A slice of bread was anything but ordinary to those who depended on it, and that is why studying medieval Irish food is not just about curiosity. It helps us see how people lived, how they organized their world, and what they believed truly mattered. It reminds us that history is not just written in battles and kings, but in kitchens, fields, and firesides. So sit at that wooden table with me. Listen to the crackle of the fire, smell the peat smoke, and watch the pot simmer. The story of medieval Ireland begins, not in grand palaces, but right herein, the quiet, everyday act of preparing food from this small pot. We will travel through time, exploring how different people, peasants, monks, nobles, and kings experienced the same basic need in vastly different ways. And through their meals, we will uncover the deeper truths about who they were. When we shift our focus from the idea of kings and feasts to the ordinary people who made up most of medieval Ireland, the story of food becomes far more intimate, far more human, and sometimes far more difficult. The truth is simple. Most people did not live surrounded by abundance. They lived close to the ground, close to the animals, and close to uncertainty. Their meals reflected that reality every single day. Picture a typical peasant household in medieval Ireland. It might be a small wooden or wattle-daub structure with a thatched roof, a dirt floor, and a central hearth. Smoke darkens the beams above, and the air is always tinged with ash. Outside are fields, grazing lands, and perhaps a few small outbuildings where tools, fodder, or animals are kept. Everything about this environment revolves around work and necessity. There is no wasted space. Nothing exists purely for comfort. Everything has a purpose. On farms or rural settlements required constant effort. People woke with the sun, and their first thoughts were practical ones. Check the animals, fetch water, stoke the fire, prepare something simple to eat that would give energy for the day ahead. Food wasn't just something people looked forward to, it was their fuel and, sometimes their only reward for exhausting labor. The foundation of the peasant diet was dairying. Cattle were the lifeblood of many medieval Irish communities. A cow wasn't just an animal, it was a living pantry. Milk provided fresh nourishment when available, and when turned into butter, cheese, and curds, it could be stored and preserved. Buttermilk, a byproduct of butter-making, became a common drink or cooking liquid. Even the leftover liquid from cheese production was not thrown away, was used in soups, fed to animals, or incorporated into bread dough to make it last longer. The relationship between people and their cattle was almost sacred. Losing a cow was not just an economic blow, it could threaten survival. Diseases, thefts, raids, and harsh winters constantly jeopardized livestock. Villagers prayed for their animals, argued over grazing rights, and guarded their herds carefully. Entire social systems were structured around who owned cows, who could borrow them, and who was responsible for their care. When you imagine medieval peasants eating, imagine them thinking not only about that day's meal, but also about the animals whose milk gave them hope for tomorrow. Alongside dairy, grains formed another cornerstone of the diet. Barley and oats were the primary crops, hardy enough to grow in Ireland's climate. Wheat existed, but it was rarer and more expensive, usually reserved for wealthier households or special occasions. Oats, on the other hand, were incredibly versatile. They could be boiled into porridge, baked into flatbreads, or mixed with herbs and bits of vegetables into thick, filling stews. A bowl of hot porridge in the morning was not a luxury, it was consistency in a world where very little was guaranteed. Those grains had their own challenges. Fields required constant tending. Seeds had to be sown at exactly the right times, guarded from animals, and harvested before storms ruined crops. After harvest, the grain still had to be threshed, dried, stored, and protected from rot or vermin. A single mistake, a leak in the granary, or a long stretch of rain could mean disaster. So when a family sat down to eat bread or porridge, they tasted not just grain, but months of careful work. Vegetables and garden crops added variety when possible. People grew cabbage, leeks, onions, turnips, and root vegetables that stored well. Underground, wild plants supplemented meals, nettles, sorrel, wild garlic, and various herbs found in fields or forest edges. These plants flavored stews, provided medicinal benefits, and filled gaps when more desirable foods were scarce. Children often helped gather these greens, learning early which plants nourished and which could harm. Knowledge of the land was survival knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next. Meat was not absent from peasant diets, but it was rarely the centerpiece of everyday meals. Animals such as pigs, goats, and sheep were valuable resources. Killing one was a serious decision, usually timed for when the animal was old, sick, or required for community feasts. When slaughter finally did happen, every part was used. Meat was eaten fresh, if possible, and the rest preserved by smoking, drying, or salting. Bones became broth. Fat was stored and used for cooking, lighting, and waterproofing. Nothing was wasted because everything was needed. Fish played a larger role, especially in areas near rivers, lakes, and the coast. Fishing required skill and patience, but could provide significant protein when livestock resources were stretched thin. People used nets, traps, and sometimes spears, catching salmon, trout, eels, and other species, depending on location. Drying and smoking fish allowed it to last through leaner months. In many ways, the availability of fish meant the difference between hunger and survival during difficult seasons. Meals themselves were simple, repetitive, and practical. The central hearth served both as the kitchen and the heart of the home. Over it hung iron pots used for countless stews and porridges. Wooden spoons, bowls, and trenchers replaced the plates and cutlery we use today. People often shared from the same pot or bowl, dipping in carefully and eating modest portions. There were no elaborate courses. There was no dessert. Food was eaten slowly, with gratitude and caution. Salt's something we take for granted. Today was expensive and not easily accessible. This meant food could rarely be seasoned heavily, and preservation techniques like drying and smoking were crucial. The taste of medieval peasant cooking was likely earthy, smoky, and mild, shaped more by necessity than by creativity, though creativity certainly existed in the quiet ingenuity of stretching small ingredients into filling meals. Hunger was always a shadow in the background. Harsh winters could be terrifying. Once the fresh greens vanished, once the last fruits were gone, families depended entirely on whatever they had. Preserved crops stored underground, smoked meats in rafters, dried fish by the hearth. These were lifelines. Running out meant relying on neighbors, begging from monasteries, or in the worst cases enduring starvation. People lived with this awareness constantly, which shaped their attitudes toward food. Waste wasn't merely frowned upon, it was unthinkable. Despite the hardships, peasant meals also had moments of warmth and meaning. Eating together forged a sense of unity. Families gathered at night, talking quietly, sharing stories, or simply resting in silence after long labor. The act of sharing food symbolized trust and belonging. Hospitality, even among those with very little, remained a cultural value. A traveler might be offered bread or buttermilk, not because the host had plenty, but because generosity was seen as honorable and deeply human. Seasonal rhythms structured the entire food system. In spring, there was renewed milk from calving cows, fresh herbs growing near streams, and the promise of life returning. Summer brought more abundant dairy, fish, and sometimes grazing feasts. Autumn became the season of harvest and preservation, when families worked frantically to collect every possible resource before winter. Winter, in turn, was a testa, silent, cold challenge that exposed poor planning and punished unpreparedness. Surviving it required discipline, foresight, and often a bit of luck. Women played a central and often invisible role in all of this. They churned butter, managed dairy products, tended gardens, monitored stores, and cooked daily meals. They knew which foods were safe for children, which herbs could heal, and how long each supply would last. Their labor was rarely celebrated in chronicles or poems, yet it formed the backbone of survival. Without their skills, medieval communities would simply have collapsed. Children learned responsibility through food as well. They gathered wood for fires, carried water, collected eggs, and helped with small animals. They were taught how to respect tools, handle hot pots, and recognize hunger signs in livestock. Growing up, they saw firsthand that eating was not guaranteed. This awareness shaped their behavior for life. Religion added another layer to everyday eating habits. Fasting days and dietary restrictions reminded people that food had moral and spiritual dimensions. Monasteries influenced peasant communities by providing examples of modest, disciplined eating. They also acted as support systems in emergencies, sometimes offering meals to the poor or giving out stored grain during famines. This charitable role created relationships between peasants and clergy that were both practical and symbolic, even in poverty. There were occasional moments of feast weddings, seasonal festivals, or successful harvests might bring neighbors together. A pig might be roasted, ale brewed, bread baked in larger quantities than usual. These moments created memories, songs, and laughter. People remembered them not because the food was extravagant, but because it represented relief, a pause in the constant struggle. Yet it's important to note that life for peasants was not uniform. Some families had slightly better land, more cattle, or stronger community ties. Others lived on the edge of survival year after year. Geography mattered. Those near waterways experienced different diets than those in inland areas. Those connected to trade routes might access occasional luxuries or imported goods. Food, therefore, was never distributed evenly. Inequality appeared at every table. Still, the underlying theme remained the same. Food was work, food was risk, and food was deeply tied to identity. To understand what peasants ate is to understand how they lived, constantly negotiating with nature, constantly managing scarcity, constantly balancing hope and fear. When you look closely at their bowls, you see a portrait of medieval Irish society. Dairy speaks of cattle culture. Grains reveal agricultural systems. Wild greens reflect knowledge of the land. Fish shows dependence on local environments. Simple tools and small fires highlight the humble domestic reality behind the grand tales of kings and warriors. And in that simplicity lies something profoundly human. These people laughed, worried, celebrated, argued, loved, and dreamed all while stirring pots, kneading dough, and counting stored grain sacks. The foods they ate shaped their bodies, their traditions, their rituals, and even their stories. So when we explore medieval Irish food from the perspective of peasants, we uncover more than menus. We uncover resilience. We uncover community. We uncover the quiet heroism of ordinary lives lived without luxury, but filled with determination and endurance. And all of it begins with that simple meal over the fire, a bowl of porridge, a piece of rough bread, maybe a little cheese shared among family members who knew that every bite mattered. Their table may look small by modern standards, but the world it represents is vast, complex, and deeply revealing. If we leave the peasant farms and walk deeper into medieval Ireland, we eventually reach places that look calmer, quieter, almost separate from the struggles of everyday life. These places stand on wind-swept hills, beside rivers, or tucked into valleys, surrounded by stone walls and fields carefully cultivated over generations. Bells ring softly in the distance. Figures move in plain robes. Voices murmur in prayer knot. In markets or taverns, we have entered the world of the monasteries. And here, the story of food changes in subtle but important ways. Monasteries were not simply religious centers. They were economic hubs, agricultural laboratories, libraries of knowledge, and in many cases, lifelines during crisis. While peasants worked primarily to survive day by day, monks approached food with structure, discipline, and intent. They viewed it as something deeply spiritual, reminder of humility, gratitude, and responsibility. Imagine waking early in the morning inside one of these monastic communities. The air is chilled and still. Before anyone eats, there is prayer. The day begins in silence, not with chatter or laughter. A monk rises, puts on his robe, and joins the others in the chapel. Candles flicker. Psalms echo against stone walls. Hunger is acknowledged, but it waits. Spiritual duty comes first. Only after these rituals are complete do the monks turn toward their daily work, and food becomes part of that work. The diet here is simple, but compared to peasant households, it is also more organized and often more dependable. Monks do not feast like nobles. They rarely indulge. Rules restrict how much meat they can eat, and, on many days, they abstain entirely. Instead, their meals revolve around vegetables, grains, fish, dairy, and stews. Bread baked in monastery ovens fills the air with familiar warmth. Cheese rests aging on shelves. Root vegetables lie stored in cool cellars. Everything is planned. Nothing is random. This system did not arise overnight. Over time, monasteries learned to cultivate land carefully and intelligently. Instead of focusing on a single crop, they diversified. They experimented with orchards growing apples and pears. They built herb gardens filled with medicinal plants such as sage, mint, and rosemary. These herbs flavored food, but more importantly, they healed wounds, soothed illnesses, and provided remedies when doctors were rare and distant. Knowledge of which plants cured fever and which calmed pain was precious, and monks guarded and recorded it. Throughout the grounds there are fields of barley and oats tended with patience. There are fish ponds stocked deliberately so that monks can maintain a reliable protein source without hunting. Beehives hum quietly nearby, producing honey not only for sweetness, but for medicine and preservation. The monastery is not just a religious community. It is a carefully balanced ecosystem designed to support life, charity, and study all at once. Inside the kitchens, the rhythm remains steady. Meals are never extravagant. The cook ladles out thick, nourishing stews made with vegetables, grains, and sometimes fish. A loaf of bread sits at every meal. Cheese appears regularly, consumed in moderation. Milk products are used thoughtfully, ever wasted, always respected. There is always enough to avoid starvation, but rarely enough to allow indulgence or gluttony. That balance lies at the heart of monastic eating. Everything in proportion, everything with purpose. The rules surrounding meals serve spiritual goals. Silence is often observed during eating. Instead of conversation, scripture or teachings may be read aloud so that knowledge nourishes the mind while food sustains the body. Monks are reminded constantly that eating is not entertainment or distraction. It is preparation for service. Even the way food is distributed reinforces humility. Each monk accepts what is given without complaint, without asking for more, and without comparing plates. In this way, meals become miniature lessons in obedience, patience, and equality. Yet discipline does not mean coldness. There is kindness in the way monasteries approach food, not only toward themselves, but toward others. Unlike many households struggling to survive, monasteries often had surplus storage. Their granaries held grain, their cellars stored ale and preserved goods. Their fields produced beyond what the monks alone required. Instead of hoarding everything for themselves, they extended hospitality. Travelers, pilgrims, the poor, and the desperate could knock on monastery doors seeking a dawn. Quite often, they found it. Imagine a weary traveler arriving during winter half-starved, perhaps fleeing danger or searching for work. In many places, the monastery would offer shelter and a simple meal, not luxury, but warmth, bread, stew, maybe cheese, maybe ale. That act meant dignity and survival. The monks believed feeding strangers reflected their faith, so charity became part of their food economy. In a world where famine and scarcity lingered constantly, these gestures saved lives and cultivated gratitude that echoed through nearby villages. Beyond charity, monasteries played another crucial role in Ireland's food story. They preserved knowledge. While books in other parts of Europe burned in wars, Irish monks copied manuscripts, including texts on agriculture, medicine, and natural science. These writings recorded planting techniques, preservation methods, and even recipes. They documented what worked and what failed. They created a practical bridge between generations. Farmers might forget details if famine scattered families, but monastery libraries kept memory alive. Through ink, parchment, and discipline, food wisdom survived. Over time, monks also helped introduce innovations. They tried new ways of draining marshland to create usable farmland. They experimented with irrigation. They discovered better methods of storing grain so it wouldn't rot as easily. When these techniques succeeded, nearby peasants noticed. Some monasteries distributed seeds, shared tools, and taught farming practices to local communities. Slowly, invisibly, they improved agricultural productivity around them. In that sense, monasteries shaped medieval Irish diets from behind the scenes. They were silent engineers of food stability. However, it is important to understand that monasteries were not utopias. They also depended on surrounding lands, rents, and labor systems. Some controlled vast estates. Peasants sometimes worked lands technically owned by monastic orders. Political alliances still mattered. Power still influenced everything. So, while monks preached humility, they also navigated the realities of wealth and resource management. But overall, their influence on food leaned toward preservation, moderation, and welfare other than waste or indulgence. Walking through a monastery during mealtime reveals contrasts that explain why they mattered so much. Unlike peasant homes struggling day to day, here people know when they will next eat. Unlike noble feasts filled with music and performance, here meals are quiet, structured, and reflective. Yet food is never taken for granted. Every loaf represents labor. Every bowl of stew represents land, weather, prayer, and cooperation. Gratitude is part of every swallow. There is also a fascinating psychological side to monastic food culture. By limiting what they ate, monks believed they could control their desires. Hunger, they felt, should not rule the mind. Discipline at the table translated into discipline in prayer, writing, and moral behavior. Too much feasting led to pride. Too much deprivation led to weakness. Their goal was balance, the same balance they sought in gardens and fields. In this way, their dinner tables became tools for shaping character. Fish played a particularly symbolic role. On religious fast days, meat was forbidden, but fish remained allowed. Lakes, rivers, and coastal waters became spiritual as well as economic resources. Monastic fish ponds, carefully designed, ensured supply throughout the year. For monks, eating fish was an act of obedience to religious tradition, but it also reflected clever planning. Instead of seeing food rules as restrictions, they treated them as challenges to be solved creatively. Think, for a moment, about what it must have been like to live here permanently. You work hard, pray often, ever go hungry, but never indulge. You garden, write, care for livestock, copy books, and make cheese or ale. Your days repeat, not with boredom, but with rhythm. The world beyond the monastery is chaotic. Wars, famines, disputes, feasts, hunger, but inside, life remains steady. That steadiness is what makes monasteries so important to the story of medieval Irish food. They offered continuity in a world defined by uncertainty. When famine struck, when raiders burned fields, when harsh winters killed livestock, monastery storehouses sometimes meant survival for entire regions. Leaders and villagers alike would turn to these religious communities for aid. While monks could not solve every crisis, they often did more than anyone else to soften its impact. That reputation fostered trust. It deepened the relationship between church and community, binding people not only through faith, but through shared dependence on food security. Some monasteries even became trading centers. They sold their surplus, acquired new items, and sometimes imported foods unavailable locally, such as certain wines or preserved goods. These exchanges connected rural Ireland to broader European markets. Through trade, ideas about cooking, farming, and preservation spread. Although monks lived apart from society, they were not isolated. They sat at the crossroads of faith, agriculture, economy, and education, shaping each quietly. Inside the dining hall, the daily meals symbolized all of this. Bowls lined the table, bread waited in baskets. The cook carried a ladle, moving with calm familiarity. No one rushed, there was no pushing, no one demanded more than what was fair. If food ran short, everyone shared the burden equally. If a special guest arrived, monks might offer them slightly better portions, practicing hospitality as a virtue. Eating, therefore, became an expression of morality, order, and collective identity. Night settled, and the monastery dimmed. After the final prayers, kitchens cooled, fires softened, and silence deepened. Somewhere, a monk wrote in a manuscript about crop yields, weather conditions, or lessons learned from recent harvests. Those notes might one day save a village during famine. Someone else checked the grain stores, ensuring rats had not breached them. Another tended animals before sleep. The community remained always aware that food was fragile, vulnerable, and deserving of protection. It is easy today to overlook the importance of these quiet institutions. We imagine medieval life as loud battles, heroic kings, or suffering peasants. But between those extremes lived the monks, bridging heaven and earth, scripture and stew, prayer and plow. Without them, much agricultural knowledge might have vanished. Without their cellars and granaries, more people would have starved. Without their discipline, history might carry far fewer records of how people lived, ate, and endured. And yet, despite all their discipline, monks were still human. They grew hungry, they grew tired. They sometimes longed for richer foods, fuller tables, more excitement. Rules were occasionally broken. Some monasteries became wealthier than intended, drifting slowly toward luxury. When that happened, reform movements emerged, reminding communities to return to simplicity. The story of monastic food is therefore also a story of constant correction, a reminder that balance must be renewed. Never assumed, looking at medieval Ireland through the lens of monasteries reveals something profound. Food is never just physical. It carries spiritual meaning, moral lessons, and social consequences. It shapes how people view themselves and how they relate to others. In monasteries, food unified prayer, agriculture, charity, and education into a single daily ritual. Eating together reinforced commitment. Sharing strengthened faith. Discipline formed identity. So when we reflect on medieval Irish food, we cannot ignore these stone-walled communities. They were the quiet farmers when others fought. They were the record keepers when memories were fragile. They were the caregivers when famine came knocking. And in every bowl of stew, every loaf of bread, every fish drawn from their ponds, we see a philosophy. Life should be sustained with care, not consumed with greed. The next time you imagine medieval Ireland, Picture not only warriors and kings, but also monks bent over gardens, stirring pots, reading by candlelight, simple meals to strangers. In those moments, they shaped history in ways grand battles never could. Their tables may have lacked extravagance, but they offered something just as powerful: stability, knowledge, and compassion. And as our journey continues, we carry their lessons forward. From monasteries, the story of food moves outward once, again toward towns, trade routes, noble halls, and eventually into the feasts of kings. But the quiet discipline of the monks remains in the background, a steady heartbeat beneath the shifting rhythms of medieval life. In the story of medieval Ireland, there is a quiet turning point that doesn't always get as much attention as battles, kings, or monasteries: the gradual rise of towns, markets, and the slow but powerful flow of trade. For centuries, Irish life was deeply rooted in local farming, cattle raising, and seasonal cycles. Communities produced most of what they consumed. Food came from fields nearby, cattle grazing on familiar land, and rivers only a short walk from the settlement. But as new influences arrived, Norse settlers, traveling merchants, church connections, to wider Europe, and eventually the Anglo-Normans, a new kind of world began edging in. That shift changed not only how people lived, but what they tasted, valued, and imagined possible on their tables. Trade didn't come all at once, and it didn't replace traditional diets overnight. Instead, it trickled season by season, boat by boat, cart by cart. A farmer might first notice it as a strange new flavor in stew, a spice he could barely pronounce. A noble might first notice it in a polished drinking vessel from abroad, or in a wine that tasted richer than local ale. A monk might notice it in new seeds sent with travelers, promising hardier crops, or different varieties of fruit. Slowly, these pieces fit together, forming a picture of Ireland becoming more connected to worlds beyond its shores. The earliest big push came with the arrival of the Vikings in the 8th and 9th centuries. Though they were feared at first for raids, they also did something transformative. They built towns. Places like Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Limerick, and Cork became centers of exchange. Ships sailed in and out of harbors carrying goods, news, and ideas. Fish, hides, wool, and slaves went out. In return, metalwork, glass beads, textiles, salt, and exotic items arrived. With towns, markets developed not just informal gatherings, but structured trading hubs with regular rhythms. Weekly markets and seasonal fairs began shaping economic life. People brought butter, cheese, cured fish, hides, grain, and livestock to barter. Instead of only relying on what their own land could produce, they could now trade surplus for something else they lacked. As this pattern deepened, food culture subtly evolved. Fish once mostly consumed near the coast or rivers moved farther inland in preserved forms. Salted herring, dried cod, and smoked fish became staples of travel and trade. Salt itself vital for preserving meat, and fish became more available through coastal trade networks. With more consistent access to salt, people could plan further ahead, experimenting with storing larger quantities of food for winter or journeys. Households still relied on smoking and drying, but salt opened up new techniques and improved reliability. Meanwhile, the monasteries had long been part of wider European networks, connecting Ireland with England, France, Italy, and beyond. Pilgrims and scholars traveled, carrying stories of new tastes and farming practices. Over time, vineyards in warmer regions sent wine across the sea, particularly prized by clergy and nobility. Wine was not merely a luxury, it had sacramental use in religious rituals. But beyond the church, it became a symbol of sophistication, refinement, and connection to a cosmopolitan world. Drinking wine was, in a way, drinking a piece of Europe. Spices followed that same path. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and ginger were incredibly expensive and traveled astonishingly long distances along caravans and sea routes. They often passed through several merchant hands before ever reaching an Irish port. When they arrived, they didn't land in peasant kitchens, at least not at first. They appeared in noble halls during feasts and in monasteries on special feast days. A tiny amount could transform broth, glaze meats, or scent pastries with unfamiliar warmth. These spices did more than flavor food. They spoke loudly about status. Owning pepper meant wealth. Serving spiced dishes hinted at power, trade connections, and taste. It showed that the host had a foot in wider networks beyond local fields. Markets also influenced farming practices. As towns grew, urban populations needed steady supplies of food. Farmers now had reasons not simply to feed themselves, but to produce surplus. Butter especially became a major commodity. Ireland was famous for dairy, and butter could be churned, salted, stored in barrels, and even buried in bogs to preserve it. Bogs-rich, acidic wetlands acted as natural refrigerators. Butter that survived months or even years could be dug up and traded. This bog butter phenomenon reveals creativity and adaptation, but also the expanding role of preserved dairy. In markets, cattle, already central to Irish culture and economy, gained even more significance through trade. A herd wasn't only food, it represented wealth, dowry, tribute, and leverage. Cattle could be moved across regions and exchanged as political or economic bargaining chips. As trade intensified, controlling pasture land became increasingly valuable. Nobles who commanded fertile plains could support more cattle, which meant more dairy, more beef during feasts, and more power in negotiations. Decisions about food were never just practical. They were deeply tied to status and authority. Another layer of change came from technological developments. Iron tools improved plowing and harvesting. Better plows allowed some areas with heavier soil to be farmed more efficiently. As fields expanded, communities grew, slightly less vulnerable to immediate famine, though bad harvests still posed real danger. Grain became more plentiful, sometimes enough to be traded beyond local use. Mills' water, powered in many places, ground grain faster and more evenly, making fine flour a bit more accessible, especially around towns. Bread gradually joined porridge as a more common form of grain consumption, although in rural areas, thick porridge and oatcakes still dominated everyday life. The Anglo-Norman arrival in the 12th century accelerated urbanization and agricultural planning. Castles rose, and alongside them planned towns with structured streets, market squares, and storage warehouses. Anglo-Normans brought new customs, enclosed fields, orchards, rabbit warrens, and increased emphasis on wheat-based bread. They encouraged larger-scale production for trade, pushing some regions toward specialized goods, wheat here, dairy elsewhere. This approach built stronger links between regions. No community stood entirely alone anymore. What happened in one area could ripple elsewhere. The seasonal fairs became legendary occasions, bustling with jugglers, traders shouting prices, animals bleating, barrels rolling. People walked miles to attend. They bought knives, pottery, of course, food, sweet treats, if available, were unforgettable experiences. Honey pastries, dried fruits like figs or raisins or candied nuts. Children who tasted something so rare might talk about it for months. Adults weighed carefully whether to spend precious coins on luxuries when salt, seeds, or tools offered more practical value. Social distinctions deepened as food options diversified. Peasants still relied mainly on oats, vegetables, dairy, and fish. Their meals remained practical, filling, and resourceful. They rarely handled spices or fine bread, but compared to earlier centuries, they encountered slightly more variation thanks to markets, a piece of imported dried fish here, perhaps a taste of ale brewed with different grains there, for townsfolk especially. Merchants and skilled craftsmen became richer and more varied than those of the countryside. Access shaped experience. The closer one lived to trade hubs, the more likely unusual ingredients appeared. Cooking methods adapted as well. Cauldrons, spits, and hearths remained central, but recipes evolved. Cooks learned to combine local ingredients with imported seasonings. A stew might now feature a hint of pepper. A roast might be glazed with honey and spiced wine. Cheese could be flavored with herbs grown in monastery gardens, influenced by continental horticulture. Even sauces once uncommon began to appear at noble feasts, mixing broth, breadcrumbs, herbs, vinegar, and spices. Religious practices strongly influenced patterns of demand. Numerous fasting days restricted meat consumption, increasing reliance on fish and dairy. With trade networks, salted and dried fish could now meet that demand more consistently. Coastal fisheries expanded. Some towns specialized in processing fish specifically for church calendars. Thus, religion and economics intertwined deeply. Trade also changed how people thought about distance. Before, far away often meant a neighboring region. Now it meant lands across the sea. Merchants with accents from England, France, or even farther east along trade routes. Food became a language connecting different cultures. A spice came with a story. A piece of pottery suggested craftsmanship from another shore. Market spaces turned into hubs of gossip, negotiation, friendship, rivalry, and unexpected cultural blending. Of course, not everyone welcomed change. Some feared loss of tradition, feeling that imported foods symbolized intrusion and dependency. Others worried that luxury would corrupt values or widen class divides. And in many ways, those concerns were justified. Powerful households flaunted imported items as markers of distinction. The gap between what a lord ate at his feast and what a peasant ate by the hearth could feel enormous. Trade did not erase hardship. Famine still struck during bad harvests or conflict. War disrupted routes. Prices soared in lean times. But overall, trade layered resilience on top of vulnerability. People had more options, not infinite, but gradually expanding. The rise of guilds in towns brought further organization. Bakers, brewers, butchers, and fishmongers formed recognized groups, regulating quality and price. Bread standards emerged. Certain weights and measures were enforced. These systems helped stabilize urban food supply. Street vendors sold hot food pies, stews, skewers of meat. Travelers could eat without relying solely on hospitality. Inns and taverns became social centers where ale flowed and stew simmered. The environment also shaped trade. Ireland's fertile grasslands supported robust dairying, which remained foundational despite foreign influences. Forests supplied game and wood for cooking. Rivers functioned as natural highways, carrying goods inland where roads were poor. Ports became doorways to the world. Each element balanced the other local ecosystem, meeting external opportunity. Gradually, the Irish palate changed not dramatically in a single generation, but inch by inch. A grandchild might grow up thinking of wine or spices as rare but known, whereas their grandparents might never have tasted them. Recipes traveled orally, shifting with each retelling. One household added more herbs. Another used ale instead of water for stewing. Another experimented with combinations inspired by overheard stories at market stalls. Food writing, as we know it, didn't yet exist, but regulations, monastic notes, and archaeological evidence paint part of the picture. Carbonized grains in hearths, fragments of pottery, residues in cooking pots, preserved fish bones, animal remains near castles, charred bread near abandoned mills. These remnants whisper about markets humming, merchants shouting prices, and ships rocking gently at port as sacks of grain, barrels of butter, and amphorae of wine were unloaded. Trade also meant risk storms, piracy, spoiled cargo. A lost ship could cost a merchant everything, but the promise of profit outweighed fear for many. And with each successful voyage, Ireland grew slightly more connected to international economic currents. Over time, trade influenced not just what people ate, but how they saw themselves. Nobles aligned their tastes with continental elites. Town merchants developed identities tied to commerce. Peasants learned to navigate markets strategically, knowing which times of year produced the best deals. Food moved beyond nourishment. It became communication, saying something about wealth, identity, alliances, and aspiration. Looking at this chapter of history, we see that medieval Irish food didn't simply evolve because recipes changed. It transformed because networks changed. Roads, ships, markets, politics, religion, technology all intersected around the table. A bowl of stew, a piece of bread, a glass of ale, or a slice of meat carried hidden stories about supply lines, taxes, trade privileges, and foreign ports. Every mouthful contained history, and yet, despite all the new flavors and influences, the heart of Irish food culture remained rooted in the land. Dairy stayed central. Cattle still defined wealth. Communal meals continued to symbolize hospitality and honor. The innovations layered on top rather than replacing what had come before. That is perhaps the true essence of this period, a delicate balance between tradition and transformation. Trade didn't erase the past. It wove the past into something bigger. It taught medieval Ireland that even the simplest meal poured dread, a little fish, a measure of ale connected ordinary lives to vast unseen networks across seas and continents. And slowly, quietly, those networks reshaped the island one market day and one meal at a time. In medieval Ireland, food at the level of nobles and kings was never just about taste or hunger. It was about spectacle, hierarchy, obligation, and power. A feast could cement loyalty, reward bravery, intimidate enemies, or celebrate victory. To sit at the table of a chieftain or king meant stepping into a carefully choreographed world where every seat, every dish, every carved piece of meat carried meaning. If the peasant table taught lessons about survival, the noble hall taught lessons about authority. Imagine approaching such a hall. The structure might be a large timber building on a raised mound door, later a stone castle surrounded by high walls. Smoke escapes through the roof. Dogs roam nearby, sniffing for scraps. Cattle graze in enclosures, outside living symbols of wealth. Inside, the air is thick with the smell of roasted meat, wood smoke, fresh bread, and ale. Torches flicker. Musicians tune their instruments. The anticipation feels almost ceremonial. A guest wouldn't simply sit anywhere. Hospitality mattered deeply in Irish tradition, but hospitality existed within order. Guests were ranked. The higher your social standing, the closer you sat to the lord or king. Place mattered because proximity to power meant access to influence, favors, or alliances. This wasn't just dinner. It was political theater. Noble households had access to foods the lower classes rarely saw except on major feasts. Large cuts of meat dominated the center of the table: beef, pork, venison from the forests, and game birds like goose, crane, or occasionally swan. Meat signaled strength and wealth because raising animals, especially cattle, required extensive land, labor, and protection. When nobles served meat generously, they sent a message: we are prosperous. We can afford abundance. Pork held special prestige. Fattened pigs required foraging rights in woodlands and careful seasonal planning. A roasted pig carried to the hall glistening and fragrant became an object of awe. Carvers, sometimes specially trained, performed the ritual of dividing meat. Each slice had symbolic meaning. Certain honored guests might receive specific cuts believed to correspond to status. Even the act of carving could reflect hierarchy. It required precision, knowledge, and ceremony. Beef carried layers of symbolism. Cattle were the backbone of the economy, sources not only of meat, but wealth, dowry, and tribute. Killing a cow wasn't taken lightly. To slaughter one for a feast meant declaring abundance. It was proof that the host commanded enough resources to keep feeding his people and still retain power. Venison added another dimension: connection to hunting. Hunts were more than food-gathering missions. They were displays of control over land and nature. Participation in hunts showed masculinity, skill, and dominance. Bringing back deer or wild boar provided stories as well as meals. Meat from the hunt held prestiges, seasoned by adventure, retold over cups of ale in exaggerated, heroic style. Alongside meat came bread, though its quality varied. Where peasants might rely on coarse oatcakes, nobles increasingly enjoyed wheat-based bread. As towns and mills expanded, white bread, refined and soft, symbolized refinement and luxury. Baking required skilled labor, controlled heat, and good grain. Serving bread at feasts helped distinguish noble tables from humble ones, emphasizing the difference between those who toiled and those who ruled. Dairy remained important, especially butter and cheese. Butter was rich, nourishing, and versatile. It could be melted into sauces, spread on bread, or added to porridge. In Irish tradition, butter carried almost magical associations, sign of fertility, richness, blessing. For nobles, butter also represented surplus. Only someone with large herds could provide it generously. Cheese aged in storage rooms, or cellars added depth to meals, especially during seasons when fresh produce waned. Honey provided sweetness long before sugar became common. Beekeeping allowed noble households to produce honey both as food and as a fermenting agent. Honey sweetened desserts, glazed roasted meats, or flavored drinks. It could soften strong flavors or turn ordinary grains into celebratory treats. Honey cakes or spiced pastries might appear at the end of a feast, leaving guests with a final memory of abundance. Drinks flowed freely in, they mattered immensely. Ale, brewed from grains, was common and shared by many social classes, but nobles consumed it with richer meals and sometimes higher quality ingredients. Mead fermented honey mixed with water and sometimes herbs had ancient, almost mythical associations. It was the drink of legends, heroes, and kings. To raise a horn of mead was to participate in a tradition stretching far back, linking the present feast to ancestors and folklore. Wine became increasingly important as trade networks expanded. Because it had to be imported, wine was a luxury item. Serving it showed connection to broader European culture, distinguishing noble houses that could afford it from those that relied solely on local brews. Clergy used wine for religious ceremonies, but nobles adopted it as a status symbol. Thin glass or fine cups, imported from abroad, added yet another layer of refinement. Drinking wine wasn't only about enjoyment. It was a way of saying, we are part of the world beyond our own fields. Feasts required preparation on a massive scale. Kitchens hummed with constant motion. Cooks oversaw cauldrons large enough to feed dozens. Assistants chopped herbs, stirred stews, and tended fires. Spits turned slowly, sometimes powered manually by children or servants rotating large joints of meat. The timing mattered. Food had to arrive in rhythm with storytelling, speeches, and rituals. Cooking wasn't simply domestic. It was logistically military. Beneath the glamour lay layers of labor, often invisible in the final presentation. Servants fetched water, hauled firewood, cleaned pots, and carried dishes. Farmers supplied livestock. Hunters risked their lives in forests. Fishermen braved rough waters. Women in the household churned butter, baked bread, and preserved ingredients months in advance. The feast was the visible tip of a pyramid of effort, demonstrating how resources flowed upward to the Lord, and then back down in carefully staged generosity. Generosity itself was a core theme. A good lord was expected to feed his followers. Refusing hospitality could tarnish a reputation or spark conflict. Poets and bards recorded tales of famous feasts where kings welcomed hundreds. In Irish law and tradition, hospitality was intertwined with honor. Sharing food reinforced bonds marking loyalty between the host and his guests. Gifts might be exchanged, weapons, jewelry, cattle. Agreements might be sworn over shared dishes. Food became the glue of alliances. At the same time, hospitality was tightly controlled. Guests could be dismissed by where they sat. An arrival might be seated at the farthest edge of the hall, still welcomed, but clearly shown limits. A favored ally might receive the best cut of meat or special servings. When new warriors were accepted into a lord's household, sharing a meal often symbolized their inclusion into the group. Eating together meant belonging. Noble feasts also served cultural and emotional roles. Storytellers recited sagas of heroic ancestors, often linking the host's lineage to legendary figures. These stories reinforced identity and justified power. A king who could trace noble ancestry through poetic tradition strengthened his authority in the ears of his audience. Music, harps, flutes, drums filled the spaces between choruses, weaving sound into memory. Dancing, laughter, and sometimes heated debate followed, all framed by the steady rhythm of serving and eating. Rituals of restraint existed, too. Not every day was a feast. Even nobles observed fasting days established by the church. On those days, meat was restricted, and fish, eggs, or dairy replaced it. But even then, the quality of fish might be superior compared to that available to peasants. Noble fasting could still involve elaborate preparations, showing discipline while maintaining prestige. This blend of religious observance and privilege reveals how deeply faith intertwined with table culture. Weapons and political danger always lingered at the edges. A feast could turn tense if rival clans attended. Old wounds could resurface with too much drink. Hostile glances could flicker across the room. Yet the feast also served as neutral ground, a space where diplomacy played out in carefully measured gestures. Sharing bread might signal temporary truce. Offering a cup could symbolize trust. Violating hospitality rules by attacking a guest was seen as deeply dishonorable, though history shows it occasionally happened, proving just how fragile peace could be. Castles added new environments for feasting. Stone halls created different acoustics and visual impressions. Banners hung overhead. Tapestries depicted victories or religious scenes. The space itself communicated permanence and protection. To dine within thick walls counted as privilege. Guests passed guards and gateways, reminding them of the Lord's authority before ever touching a plate. Food choice often reflected seasons just as much as social rank. Even nobles had to plan carefully around winter scarcity, but they could counter shortages with preserved stocks, salted meats, dried fish, smoked hams, and stored grain. Cellars and storerooms were guarded because they represented survival. Through hard months, a well-stocked storehouse signaled competent leadership. A poorly prepared lord risked famine and, perhaps, rebellion from hungry followers. Feasts marked milestones: births, weddings, political agreements, inaugurations of kings, and victories in battle. During coronations, food played symbolic roles. The act of feeding people publicly demonstrated the new ruler's responsibility. By offering food, the king promised stability and protection. In turn, the people, noble warriors, church leaders pledged loyalty, partially sealed through shared meals. Eating together became part of the ritual of governance. Women, especially noble women, often played influential roles in food organization. They supervised household management directed servants, controlled stores, and sometimes negotiated supplies. Their skill shaped the success of feasts more than written records often acknowledge. A well-organized household enhanced a lord's reputation almost as surely as his ability in war. Imported items added foreign glamour: raisins, figs, dates, almonds. These dried fruits arrived rarely but stunned diners when they did. They enhanced dishes layered with honey or spices. Each bite carried the impression of distant lands and complex trade networks. To demonstrate worldly connections, guests might whisper in amazement, remembering the feast long afterward. Behind the glamour, calculations took place. Every feast carried cost: slaughtering multiple animals, opening valuable stores, and providing wine. All drained resources. A wise lord balanced display with sustainability. Too many feasts could impoverish a household. Too few could weaken loyalty. Political skill lay in knowing when to feed generously and when to conserve quietly. Bards immortalized successful feasts. In verse, songs praised rulers who never let the table grow empty. Such praise mattered because word traveled. A reputation for hospitality attracted allies and wandering poets who, in return, spread stories reinforcing the host's prestige. Conversely, stinginess could brand a leader weak or cruel in societies where honor carried real weight. Reputation could build or break power. Ceremony reached even into how people behaved at the table. Etiquette rules guided who spoke when, who carved which dish, and who was allowed to address the Lord directly. Fine manners emphasized civilization, distinguishing the noble class from the supposed roughness of common folk. Eating with knives. Sometimes spoons required skill. Shared drinking vessels encouraged bonding, but also highlighted privilege. Those closest to the Lord might drink from finer cups. Dogs prowled near the tables, waiting hopefully. Bones and scraps sometimes went their way. Bones also went to workers or poorer dependents after feasts ended. Leftovers could be distributed, strategically reinforcing obligations. A lord who shared leftovers with the hungry gained respect. Ignoring the needy might stir resentment. Halls after feasts told their own stories. Trampled rushes on the floor, grease-stained wooden boards, empty barrels leaning against walls, tired musicians packing instruments. All of this reflected effort and energy spent in service of power. Servants cleaned long into the night. Fires slowly died down, and yet even as the hall quieted, decos remained in memory and rumor. Political tensions often simmered beneath celebration. If tribute from subject territories supplied meat or cattle, the feast represented visible proof of dominance. Each bite taken suggested submission by those who had provided resources. Sometimes, conquered or subordinate leaders were required to attend and witness grandeur as a reminder of their position. Feasts could humiliate as easily as they could honor, depending on how they were staged. Religion sometimes sanctified these gatherings. Priests blessed food, asked God's favor, and framed abundance as divine approval. A ruler who fed people well could claim moral legitimacy. Failure, famine, meager gatherings, empty stores might be interpreted as punishment or Thus, feasts linked earthly leadership with heavenly judgment, giving them spiritual weight. In poetic traditions, mythical heroes feasted before great battles, Feasts represented preparation, unity, and courage. Medieval nobles shaped their own behavior to echo these legendary patterns, consciously aligning themselves with heroes of old. By reenacting myth through elaborate meals, they wrote themselves into cultural memory, hoping their names would also endure in songs. Not every feast dazzled. In times of war or crop failure, even nobles faced shortages. Feasts became smaller, simpler, less joyful. Tension hung over them, yet efforts were still made to maintain form. Even in scarcity, rituals survive, often sustained by careful rationing or borrowed supplies. The symbolism of holding a feast even reduced matter. As much as the physical nourishment, as trade increased, foreign influences slowly blended with Irish customs. Anglo-Norman nobles introduced more structured dining customs, more elaborate sauces, and a stronger emphasis on wheat bread. Castles developed separate kitchens, pantries, and great halls, all designed to elevate feasting into both an art and a political instrument. Through every course, every guest, every carved joint of meat, power was performed and history was made, one meal at a time.